Welcome to the Theology of Love. I'm your host, Theology. This is a place where we explore Scripture honestly, think deeply, and let love be the lens that we see through so that we can examine with it more clearly, with more coherence, and critically look at the Bible to discover more than at first glance. This week, or this episode, we're looking at Numbers chapter 22. It is really a strange chapter. It's one of those chapters that feels unusual almost immediately. There is tension in it, but there is also satirical humor in it. There's political fear, spiritual performance, royal insecurity, and one of the strangest scenes in the Bible, a talking donkey seen more clearly than a man who is supposed to be the spiritual expert in Numbers 22, 21 through 30. At first glance, it can feel almost absurd, like a story that does not quite know whether it wants to be serious or funny. But I don't think this is strange. I don't think the strangeness is accidental. I think it's a part of how the chapter makes its point. The oddity and the comedy is carrying the weight of the message. As I sit with this chapter, what stands out most to me is that it seems to be about God's faithfulness to his promise and to the foolishness of thinking that human power, ritual expertise, or spiritual schemes can overturn what God has already decided to bless and promise in Numbers 22:12 and from Genesis 12:2 through 3. That, to me, feels like the center of the whole thing. But I also think this chapter becomes much more meaningful when we slow down enough to understand the world behind it. This is not just a strange religious story floating in space. It is part of an ancient world, and the subtext and context of that world matters. To understand the weight of this moment, it helps to remember where we are in the larger story. Israel has just wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, Numbers 14 through 33 through 34. They are not at the beginning anymore. They are nearing the land that God had promised them in Genesis 17, 7 through 8 and Numbers 22, 1. They have already had some success, and now the surrounding peoples are beginning to feel threatened by them in Numbers 21 through 21, 35 and 22, 2 through 4. They are no longer just a struggling group out in the wilderness. They are becoming a visible military force in the region. Their movement means something. Their presence changes the political atmosphere. That matters because in the ancient world, rulers were constantly reading the movement of people, the shifting of borders, the strength of neighboring groups, and the threat of instability. Land, power, and divine favor were all tied together, much more tightly than many modern people might realize today. A king was not just a military figure. He was also understood as somebody responsible for maintaining order in relation to the gods, to the land, and to the future of his people. So in this chapter, when Israel appears near Moab, Balak is not just nervous in a private emotional sense. He is responding as a ruler whose world feels unstable. It's Numbers 22, 2 through 4. That is where Balak enters the story. Balak, the king of Moab, sees Israel and becomes afraid. He sees their numbers, their movement, and their presence, and he does not believe he can simply ignore them. But instead of thinking only politically or militarily, he reaches for something spiritual. He sends for Balaam, a figure the text presents as a recognized seer, somebody believed to have access to spiritual power, Numbers 22, 5 through 6. Now, Balak wants Balaam to come to curse Israel because he believes that if Israel can be weakened spiritually, they will be weakened and thus easier to defeat in battle, Numbers 22, 6. That setup tells us a lot of the ancient world. In the modern world, many people tend to divide politics from religion and religion from public power, at least in theory. But in the ancient Near East, those things were intertwined. Blessings and curses were not treated as empty words. Divination was not a fringe activity. It was mainstream. Ritual specialists, seers, prophets, and diviners often occupied real social and political importance. Kings sought insight from them. Leaders wanted access to the divine world because they believed sacred forces could shape outcomes in battle, in fertility, weather, protection, kingship, and national destiny. So when Balak sends for Balaam, he is not acting irrationally by the standards of his time. He is acting like a ruler in an ancient world, where divine power was often thought to be mediated through recognized specialists, cited in Numbers 22, 5-7. That makes the story more interesting to me because Balak is not just a cartoon villain. He is a ruler acting out of a normal ancient assumption. If the future looks dangerous, find a way to recruit divine power to your side. If a military answer does not feel secure enough, then perhaps there is a sacred answer. If visible force is not enough, maybe invisible forces can tip the scales. And this is where the theology of the chapter begins pressing back. Balak appears to believe that the sacred can be used for his political ends. He appears to believe that spiritual power can be managed, hired, and directed towards the outcome he wants. In other words, he's not simply afraid. He's trying to manipulate what he thinks is divine power in order to secure control. To me, this is one of the deepest things in the chapter is exposing. Balak's fear is understandable and is very human. Fear often drives rulers, leaders, and communities into desperate behaviors. But what he does here with fear is what matters. He tries to recruit the sacred into service of his own agenda. He wants spiritual power to function as a tool. He wants heaven to endorse the future he prefers. He wants to purchase leverage over history itself. And the chapter seems to say very clearly that this cannot be done. You cannot buy a different future than the one God has already intended. You cannot transact with the sacred in a way that changes what God has purposed. You cannot hire enough spiritual prestige to overturn God's covenant faithfulness. This matters because rulers and systems have always been tempted to do this. Human beings have always tried to use religion, spirituality, sacred language, or even divine authority to reinforce their own power, protect their own interests, and justify their own fears. That is not unique to Balak. It is a deeply human pattern. When people feel threatened, they often want God to ratify their side. They want sacred power to support their preferences. They want religion to stabilize their control. But Numbers 22 pushes back on that impulse. Balak is not seeking the truth here. He is not humbly asking for what is right. He is trying to use sacred access to influence the outcome. And the story in this chapter makes him look foolish for it. There is also a larger moral tension in this part of the biblical story around land, conflict, and displacement. I don't think that tension should be ignored, and I don't think it sits easily. The Moabites already live in the land. They have their own histories, identities, and claims. So if we read honestly, we should feel that tension. At the same time, I think it is also important to remember that this is Israel telling Israel's story. Anthropologically, that matters too, because human communities almost always narrate themselves through a lens of meaning, promise, chosenness, suffering, or destiny. That is not unique to Israel. It is a human tendency. We interpret our survival and our movement through our own communal story. So I don't want to minimize the tension or explain it away. I just want to say that for this chapter, the main burden of the narrative is not to solve the entire moral problem of land and displacement. Its main burden seems to be this. From inside Israel's covenant imagination, God is faithful to what he has promised. And fearful rulers cannot derail that promise by trying to manipulate the spiritual world. Then the chapter turns toward Balaam. And this is where the strangest becomes even more memorable. Balaam is important not just because he shows up here, but because he seems to represent a recognizable type in the ancient world. The seer, the diviner, the person believed to have unusual access to the spirit world. He is the kind of figure ordinary people might admire and rulers would seek out. He carries spiritual weight and prestige. That matters here because the donkey scene only works if Balaam begins as someone the audience would expect to respect and see as a spiritual authority. That's Numbers 22 through 5 and 6. This is a famous scene in which Balaam and his donkey are often read as a miracle story, but to me, it reads more like satire. It feels like a humorous and pointed reversal meant to diminish Balaam's spiritual status. Balaam is the one people would expect to have authority. He is the one recognized as a spiritual figure, the one summoned by kings, the one who supposedly sees what others cannot. He carries the aura of spiritual insight and authority. He looks like the kind of person ordinary people would assume is close to the divine. And yet, when the critical moment comes, he is the one spiritually blind. Yet, the donkey sees more clearly than he does. That's Numbers 22, 21 through 30. That's funny, but the humor is not pointless. It's doing real theological and anthropological work here. It exposes the danger of confusing reputation with true sight and wisdom. It also functions as a kind of social critique. Ancient societies were deeply structured by hierarchy, prestige, and role. But biblical narratives often seem to delight in turning those hierarchies upside down. The exalted are brought low, the overlooked perceive what the celebrated do not. The expected channels of wisdom are exposed as insufficient. In that sense, the donkey scene is not random at all. It fits the larger biblical message that God does not see rank or station in the way humans see one another in society, especially in ancient times when rank and station were heavily enforced and everyone was so conscious of it. Now that's Numbers 22, 28 to 31 and 1 Samuel 16, 7. That feels especially important to me because people do this all the time, even in modernity. We assume that because someone has spiritual rank, they must also have spiritual clarity. We assume that because someone sounds authoritative, they must know what they're talking about, or in this case, be aligned with God. We assume that because people admire them, or because they are influential, or because they have been given a platform, they must have something important to say. But this chapter warns us against exactly that kind of thinking. Balaam's reputation is not the same thing as true wisdom. His visibility is not proof of his alignment with the divine, nor does his status guarantee that he actually sees anything worthwhile or truthful. Balaam also seems to represent something else here. He stands inside a world where spirituality can be commoditized. In his world, spiritual favors and influence can be hired, exchanged, and monetized. His gifts, or whatever people believe his gifts to be, exist in a marketplace of power. That is part of the anthropology of the story too. Sacred specialists were not abstract philosophers. They often existed inside systems of exchange, patronage, and prestige in political use. And Scripture seems to be saying that God's intention for true spirituality is not for sale to kings or anyone. Spiritual authority for the Israelites must be aligned with God's will. It's not made legitimate by how impressive it appears, how profitable it is, or even how much prestige surrounds it. It's only real when it is aligned with what God actually is doing and has promised. The story seems to assume that Balaam is a person others would expect to admire spiritually. That is part of why the critique works. If he were already viewed as foolish, the donkey scene would not hit in the same way. The point is that this is a person with recognized weight, recognized status, recognized spiritual importance, and the story starts puncturing that aura almost immediately. It is saying something like, be careful who you elevate and be careful who you assume sees clearly. Do not confuse spiritual performance with actual sight. In this chapter, God's will is not vague. It is his covenant faithfulness to Israel. It's his protection of what he has already blessed. That's why Balaam's blindness matters so much. The story seems to be saying that a person can carry the appearance of spiritual power and still be fundamentally out of alignment. A person can have the name and title, the role, and the aura, and still not see clearly. I think this is meant to humble the reader because it seems spiritual admiration must always be tested. It means we shouldn't be overly impressed by spiritual performance. We have to always discern more carefully than that. This brings me to the heart of the chapter, God's faithfulness to his covenant. This is what stands above everything else in Numbers 22. God has made a promise to Israel. They have wandered for 40 years. They are now nearing the land. And this chapter seems to reassure them that no matter what stands against them in this moment, God's faithfulness is still there. This is what I hear most strongly here. God's promise is not fragile, nor does it collapse because a king is threatened. It doesn't collapse because someone attempts to use spiritual means to curse Israel. It doesn't collapse because the Moabite ruler believes he can purchase a spiritual outcome. No matter how much spiritual access he thinks he has, God's covenant faithfulness holds steady and is solid for Israel. That seems to be a reoccurring theme throughout much of the Old Testament. God remains committed to what he has spoken, even when circumstances are unstable, even when resistance arises, even when the path is long, and even when the powerful people stand in the way. That does not mean there are no tensions in the text. There are. It doesn't mean everything is simple either, but it does mean that Numbers 22 reveals something important about God's character. He is faithful to his promises no matter the conditions. And because of that, the chapter makes human resistance look foolish. That is where Balak and Balaam come together for me. Balak is foolish enough to think he can hire a different future. Balaam is blind enough not to see what even the donkey sees. The story seems to say that this is what happens when human beings become overly confident in their own power, their own status, and spiritual access. We can become blind to the truth even when it is standing right in front of us. There is also something here about how the Bible, especially the Old Testament, so often flips human expectations upside down. Human beings rank, we elevate, we assume some are above others. Ancient societies were deeply structured around hierarchy, prestige, and visible authority. And yet, these biblical stories keep undercutting that. God sees differently. The one expected to see is blind. The lowly creature sees clearly. The king with power cannot secure what he wants. The person with status is exposed. The whole chapter feels like another reminder that God does not look at rank the way humans do. That is one of the reasons I think this chapter still speaks so clearly into the present. Its main thrust is reassurance to Israel, but there's also a subtext here that matters deeply today, especially when it comes to discernment. We still live in a world where people use God language for control and where the sacred gets pulled into human agendas. Spiritual authority can often, even today, become tied to status, influence, image, money, or the ability to impress. The chapter warns us not to be naive about that and to discern with higher sensibility. Not every spiritual voice is aligned because of its position, and not every admired leader sees clearly. just as not every person with a title has true spiritual authority. We must always ask if every blessing being offered is really from God. This is the kind of discernment we must endeavor to exercise always. We need to ask something more than what does this person sound? What does this person sound confident? We need to see beyond our admiration of our leaders. We need to see past rank and influence. We need to ask whether they are actually aligned with the will of God. The question I find myself asking here is one we have already explored in our work on fruit. What is this person actually producing? Are they aligned with the will of God, or are they using spiritual language or position to serve themselves? Are they producing love, truth, humility, and faithfulness, or are they producing fear, manipulation, transaction, and control? That matters because we are often tempted to admire the polished, the elevated, and the recognized. But Numbers 22 reminds us that reputation is not the same thing as right sight. And I think there's something else worth naming here. This chapter does not only change leaders, it also changes listeners. It asks whether we are willing to see clearly. It asks whether we are willing to admit that we too can be impressed by the wrong things. We can admire charisma. We can admire power. We can admire certainty. We can admire the appearance of spiritual weight. But those things are not the same as alignment. If even Balaam can appear spiritually significant and still be blind, then surely we too also need humility in a way we discern. So where I am on Numbers 22 is this. It is strange, but it is supposed to be. The critique is not random. The satire is not empty. The oddness is carrying a serious truth. Balak cannot buy a different future. Balaam's spiritual reputation does not guarantee spiritual sight. The donkey scene exposes how easily we confuse status with alignment. And over all of it, the chapter seems to say that God is faithful to what he has promised. His covenant with Israel is not overturned by fearful kings, hired seers, or attempted curses. That leaves me with both reassurance and warning. The reassurance is that God's promises are not fragile. The warning is that we should not be fooled by power, rank, religious performance, or the appearance of spiritual authority. We should discern carefully. We should always pay attention to alignment. We should discern the fruit of our leaders. And we should not be so blind that even a donkey can see more clearly than we do. What stays with me most in this chapter is that human beings are often far more impressed with spiritual prestige than God is. We rank people, we elevate people, we assume people are above others. But this story flips that upside down. The one who appears low sees clearly. The one who appears great is exposed. And in the middle of all that, God remains faithful. Thank you for joining me in this deep dive on Numbers chapter 22. And as always, this is a place where we explore scripture honestly, think deeply, and let love be the lens. Please share this with someone if you think they need to hear this. I deeply appreciate all the love and support you offer. Every like and every view means a lot to me. Thank you again. God bless you, and I love you, and I will see you in the next chapter soon.